Hi, this is Daryl with another side-by-slide comparison for you, because I'm really busy, darn it. And also sick. Anyway, I'm working on a video about an old classic board game called Attika, which originally came out in 2003, and a new version from Super Meeple came out around 2018 called US Telegraph. Working on that video, I thought I would also do a side-by-slide comparison. First comparison, the boxes, of course. Attika is a classic rectangular, I guess they call them medium rectangles on Board Game Geek. Many Hans im Glück games are like this, along with lookout games like Agricola. It's that format. And US Telegraph is in a very standard square Ticket to Ride size box, which is bigger. And I prefer the rectangular box because you can orient it more than one way to maximize the space on your shelves, whereas if you have a square box, you're probably going to go with a Kallax. An IKEA Kallax shelf begets square board games, or square board games beget IKEA Kallax shelves. I'm not sure, but one leads to the other, and I prefer the flexibility of the rectangular one. Not much to say about the backs. I would like to point out the difference in approaches when trying to sell you on the idea of the game. Whereas Hans im Glück just more goes for a vibe, a feel. You know, a little bit of flavor text, a kind of a zoomed in photo of what the game might look like, just enough to pique your interest. And for US Telegraph, Super Meeple really goes all out trying to tell you exactly how it works and why it's interesting and why you should buy it. The former shows more confidence, I think, but certainly there's more competition now than there was back in 2003. Attika has a lovely custom plastic insert, but you can't really transport it without it becoming a big giant mess. Those discs, they will be all over the place if you try to transport this game in a vertical position. US Telegraph has a pretty basic cardboard insert. Both work fine, of course. US Telegraph is easier to transport without making a big mess. These are the player mats, and you'll notice that Attika on the left, the places to put your building tiles are black and white, and the tiles themselves are color, of course, so they really pop out on the mat. Whereas in US Telegraph, each group of buildings is a solid color on the mat, but the building tiles themselves don't share those colors, so the tokens don't really stand out. It does have a place on the right-hand side for putting your stacks of tokens, which in Attika, it doesn't provide that at all. Attika uses names on their tokens, which once you play the game a few times, you can sort of get a feel for what buildings lead to other buildings, right? A mine leads to a mint, a vineyard leads to a vintner. But it can be hard to see these, and it certainly doesn't make it very language independent, whereas in US Telegraph, which is an English-French edition, they do have the names, but not on the tokens themselves, just on the mat, and they have numbers. And the numbers are what identify the token, so if you have a 55, you know where that goes. The numbers don't work as well in practice as I would like. In general, they are somewhat consistent in that the first building in a group, the one that all the other buildings lead from, is always divisible by 10. On the far right, you see 60 to 61 to 62 to 63. Pretty clear. But it does get confusing when you're looking at, for example, the big group there in the middle, which starts with 50 and then branches out 51, 52, 53, and then 54, 55, 56, they lead to their own thing, which is 54A, 55A, 656A. I guess for first play, it's better than the words, the names, but the names work better over multiple plays, I think. Just my opinion. One improvement that they've done with the player mats is improved the player aid. The game is simple, but it's easy to explain it in a way that makes it sound complicated. The Attika playmat certainly does go into all that detail. In my experience teaching many games, I find that the longer the rules explanation is, the more complicated the game sounds. So when the game is simple, try your hardest to find a simple way, or at least a brief way, of explaining it. And Super Meeple did. So you can see in the center of the image, in the corner of that player mat, very brief, concise, and ends up being clearer than the small wall of text at the top of the Attika player mat. The playing cards. There's not a whole lot to say here. US Telegraph does come with more cards, 60 instead of 40, I believe, so you don't have to shuffle as often. The resources are slightly different, but they're just as iconic. The landscape tiles are exactly the same size and have exactly the same resources in the exact same patterns. So the tiles are essentially identical. I think US Telegraph's is very slightly thicker. Both use cardboard standees for the destinations, temples versus cities. Original Attica, the board is basically white, and you have kind of a sandy brown in the case of US Telegraph. A little bit more colorful, I guess, but let's add some tokens. So these are the 4 different player colors. Instead of yellow, they used brown, and the blue is much darker in the new edition. I find, and this is personal preference, but the colors on the tokens of Attica, they really pop off the board. The border is quite thick, the color is very pronounced, and so there's no mistaking which buildings are yours and which buildings are another player's. In the case of US Telegraph, they've taken all the colors and just kind of muted them a bit, made them darker, but also the border around them is thinner, providing more space for the building illustration in the middle. And it does mean that things don't pop out quite as much as I'd like, especially when you consider the fact that they're placed on a brown background, which is the same shade of brown as the illustration inside the token. Now, that's deliberate, so you can try to imagine there's a bunch of buildings on there built directly onto the dirt, and there's just a colored ring around it to indicate the player color. I don't mean to make a big deal about it. It does certainly work, but the colors don't stand out as well as with Attica. And finally, we have the different tokens, including the cardboard standees for the destinations again. Attica uses amphorae, and US Telegraph uses worker meeples. So there's no real preference of one over the other. They both work fine. The rules do change slightly. They're easier to get those workers in US Telegraph than to get the amphorae in Attica. And you'll also see these little coins. What are these coins for? It is to mark on your player mat when you've already constructed a building. When you've built a building onto the central play area, you can put these tokens onto your player mat to indicate that that building has already been seen and built. Very, very handy. If you go with an older version of Attica, you'll probably want to find something similar to add to it. Not that there's much room for extra stuff in the custom plastic insert, but it is a good quality of life improvement. Thanks for watching. Remember, older games like Attica and US Telegraph don't stop being good just because newer games come out. Expect a video on these games soon. Thanks. Take care.